Hello, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. I'll wait a second for people to join us before getting started. Good morning, John. So welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna. This is the 104th episode in the series. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres that look after the historic documents of the Highlands of Scotland. Those centres are located in Inverness, in Portree, in Wick, and in Fort William. So you have to let me know if you've been to any of them or if you are intending to come. I know some of the names I'm seeing coming up are quite far removed from being able to just drop in, but hopefully some of you have been into our centres and have met us and spoken with us. This series, Learn with Lorna, is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work to help us to continue to do this and many other things, then we're very grateful for that. There's a link to be able to do so in the body of the text, both on Facebook and on YouTube. Thank you, as always, for your comments last week. So last week we were looking at the stories of Veer Hobart and Christian Cameron. As I said, my colleague Rory really enjoyed pulling those stories together, and I enjoyed sharing them. So it was really nice. Rory and I were at an event in Fort William at the time it went out live. So it was really nice to see your comments coming in afterwards. So thank you for that. This week, we're carrying on with the theme of women in the Highlands and Islands. Last week, as I say, we looked at our Lochaber collections. And this week, or next week, we're looking at our Caithness collections. And today, looking at the women in the Skye Lochalsh collections, focusing on Skye Lochalsh. Particularly this week, I did a little bit of shifting around to put the Skye Lochalsh collections, particularly in this week, because it's Seachtain na Gaelic, which is the first ever, I believe, Gaelic week to be held in Scotland, entirely dedicated to the language and culture of Gaelic, and for promoting that both with native speakers and also learners, beginners, people with a general interest. And I'll come back and talk about that a little bit more at the end. But I wanted this week to make sure that we spoke about the Skye Lochalsh collections, particularly to tie into that. So my thanks to my colleague Catherine, Skye Lochalsh archivist, for her notes and thoughts about the importance of women in the story of Skye Lochalsh and in the wider Highlands and Islands. Now, last week, the 2 women I spoke about were both from big landed families with a fair amount of money behind them. And this week, we're going to look at slightly different stories. Now, I wanted to start by sharing a paragraph written by Catherine about the long tradition of women being very central to events in the Skye Lochalsh area. So this is what Catherine said. Skyhawk women, so that's women from Skye. Skyhawk women have contributed to historic events, stayed resilient during mass shifts in social power structures, using an energy, drive, and spirit from the Gaeltacht. Flowing from the feminine divine in the very landscape around us, Bonya na Caliacha, multiple female religious sites such as Anit and structures such as Hun Skye. So she's saying that there's always been a long tradition within the landscape of venerating women and keeping them central to the culture. Skyhawk, a warrior queen who, according to legend, lived around 200 BC in her fortress Hun Skye, whose name in Gaelic means shadowy. She appears in the Red Sagas, an inspiring archetype for strong women, training those strong enough to penetrate her castle in martial arts and the use of the deadly, I think it's pronounced gaebol, a type of barbed spear that enters as a single point but expands and tears flesh if removed. In the Donald Gillis collection of papers, poems, and gatherings of folk tales, which we hold in the Skye Lochalsh Archive Centre, in his notes on how Cahulan came to Skye, so a local folk legend, describing Cahulan's adventures, he said Cahulan would not have had perfect knowledge of his learnings until he went to Skyhawk, who lived in the east of Skye. He went to seek tuition from her. Now, I've spoken previously in the Castles episode, which was episode 54, about the importance of Skyhawk and her role as a warrior queen in shaping that very strong female icon, which is an archetype of a strong woman, which is so very prominent in Skye legend and culture. So there's a long story, a long tradition in the area of women being central. Catherine went on to say women have been warriors, witches, supposed witches as well, artists, activists, crofters, poets, scientists, mothers, daughters, etc., etc. And they have left a very large footprint. Some have left a very large noticeable footprint, and others have left little more than a note in the margin. And something in common across both the Highland Archive collections and generally archive collections more widely is the fact that many women's voices are hidden, silenced or marginalised, either deliberately through lack of perceived importance or just through oversight. But by digging into the collections, as we've been doing in our offices across this month of posts, we're able to bring the voices to light. We can see the voices of girls and women in school collections, in family papers, in rent records, and so on. But one thing that comes up particularly that Catherine referred to was a theme of stamina, of desire for justice, of a pursuit of equality. If you remember some time ago, back in episode 28, if you were here then with me, I spoke about the Crofters' Risings, people standing up against the enforced change of their traditional lands, often resulting in immense suffering and loss of rights. Now, often I think, and correct me as always if you have a different opinion on this, but I think we often think of moments of conflict in terms of men and the men who are involved on whatever that front line may be. But I think as we're seeing right now in the world, the impact of women is just as profound. They're either actively involved in conflict or they're the ones picking up the pieces afterwards or during. And here are two extracts from oral histories, memories of women who witnessed the Crofters' Risings and who witnessed, and I'm stumbling over my words, women who witnessed the Crofters' Risings, and in particular, who witnessed the day that a large number of Marines descended on Glendale in Skye to stamp out the protests that the Crofters were involved in against this change of land use. If you want to know more about the story, do go back to episode 28 and have a wee look. But these are two oral history extracts with women's voices remembering that moment of conflict in Skye. The first one is a Mrs. MacLeod of Holmesdale, and she says, I was about 9 years old when the Marines came to the glen. I saw them marching down the hill with their muskets and their bayonets shining, and I was so afraid that I felt my heart swelling until I thought my ribs would burst. But I couldn't even run. I thought I was turned to stone for the pain of my heart swelling. Something I just think is probably something being experienced by a lot of people around the world just now. Here's a second one from a Mrs. Macpherson of Holmesdale. And she says, when I saw the soldiers come into the glen, I was afraid, but I thought I would do as we had been told to welcome them as if they were friends. However, when I heard they were actually coming, looking for one of John's lieutenants, John being the Glendale martyr, I was so terrified that I picked up my youngest child and I ran down to the river and I hid in a hole in the riverbank. So we have evidence within our collections of women's experience of living through something very frightening. Now, across all of our archive centres, we have numerous volunteers who work for us. And in one of those who works in Skye Lochalsh Archives is Grace Wright. And Grace did an MLit, which was tied in very closely with this subject, and she used items from the Skye Lochalsh collections in her research. Now, in the course of that research and in her volunteering, Grace came across some items that she highlighted to Catherine and Anne in Skye, a bundle of documents from collection D123, which is a solicitor's collection. The bundle is entitled Papers Relating to the Ejection of Margaret Nicholson, 1877. And here's a summary of Margaret Nicholson's story. Margaret Nicholson of 4 Glenbarnesdale is significant for being a rarely preserved example of a crofting-class woman conducting negotiations in her own hand. When Sheriff Officer John Lamont tried to clear her in December 1877, he found her confined to bed and refusing to move. Nonetheless, he had her house cleared of her meagre belongings and ejected her 2 daughters. A month later, she was still in residence and wrote in her own defence, "I'm sorry to tell you that I am not able to remove. I am confined to bed since a month, and it is very likely when removed from here that I will not trouble you or anyone else for a house." Her illness was a source of some suspicion, but she received a reprieve and wrote again in February, asking to stay until the weather was warmer, writing, "I may say since I was married, without any fault of my own, but I was poor and weak, and others were strong." She was still in residence by May, when she wrote again, refusing to leave until they provided somewhere else for her to live, citing that she was a poor old blind widow that can't do anything for herself. Later, the 1886 rent collection record lists her as the premier tenant of 39 Mains, Barnesdale. Her resistance to eviction cost the estate of Skybost a total of £6, 16 shillings and sixpence. Here's another story that Grace came across in the course of her research and shared with Catherine and Anne. This time, rather than coming from a deposited collection, it has come from the County Council records, Inverness, County of Inverness records. And it's a report on braes. Telegraph clerk Mary Jane Mackenzie, 1866 to 1934, found fame among the crofters during the Crofters' War of the late 19th century by standing up to the infamous Sheriff William Ivory, Sheriff of Inverness at the time. And he is indeed infamous. When Sheriff Ivory, suspecting the postmaster was reporting the movements of the police to the rebelling crofters, tried to force her to share the contents of telegrams sent from Portree office, she was quoted by witnesses as saying very pointedly that she was not supposed to remember the contents of any telegrams transmitted. So she was obviously in a privileged position of being able to see this information that was being transferred, and was being accused of letting the crofters know what the police plans were. And so when Sheriff Ivory tried to intimidate her to get this information, he himself had committed a crime under the Telegraph Act of 1868, and there was an attempt to indict him for it in 1885. And it had a considerable impact on his reputation. Not only did he gain active opposition in the House of Commons, he was also left with almost no public supporters. Mary's bravery in standing up to one of the most powerful men in the Highlands at the time led to her being the only woman to have been central in the criminal proceedings against Highland forces of law and order at the time. The only woman whose actions were specifically referred to in the House of Commons during the Crofters' War, and when Ivory attempted to defend himself in the 1886 report to the Commissioners of the Supply of Inverness, the only woman who was specifically cited in an official report during the conflict. So it seems like a very small act in one way. You know, she's standing up saying, no, I'm not going to give you that information you're asking for. But to stand up in the face of someone more powerful than you, someone who has perceived power over you and your destiny and your community, is hugely brave and hugely important. Now, in addition to the content of that, which proves that women were there playing an active role in the Crofters' Rising, and we have other documents to illustrate that as well, what I was struck by when I was thinking over these conversations between Grace and Catherine was two things that this reminded me of. One is we constantly learn from the knowledge and the research of our users. So people sometimes assume that we know all the answers, that we are hugely experienced historians and have all these things to hand in our minds. That is not the case. What we know is our collections. And because we cover 700 years of history, we can't be experts in all of it. But what we do find is that the people who come in and use the collections quite often will give us information that we can learn from just as much as we can share our own knowledge. So that was one thing. But the second thing I thought as I was writing these notes was, and this never ceases to be amazing and be a privilege, is that the information we get from our collections depends on the questions we ask of them. If we never look for the voices of women, or we never look for the voices of other minority groups, if we don't ask those questions of our collection, then we won't get those answers out of it. And so what we know about our collections constantly changes according to what research is being done, and as I say, what questions we're asking of the records. Okay, so we've looked in the sort of the far past with Skyhawk and the warrior queen, and we've then looked at the 19th century and women's role in the Crofters Risings. What about more recent stories of women in the Skye Lochalsh collections? If you follow the Skye Lochalsh Facebook page, then you'll know that Catherine and Anne have been, as all our offices have been, sharing numerous stories on Facebook of the women in the collections. So just in the last week or two, they have been looking at Joan Wilcock's amateur photography collection, the wonderful Mcdonald sisters, who I did a previous Learn with Lorna on, amazing artists and women traveling the world and creating beautiful artworks. If you're interested in that, do go and have a look. They've spoken about Margaret Hope Macpherson, who was one of the McLean sisters that I spoke about a few weeks ago. One that I particularly liked when I came across it was a post about Flora Beaton, Marion Steele, Janet Nicholson, and Christina Mcdonald, the heroines of Idrigal Raiders. Those women, again, this is another land dispute that was happening in the area, and these women supplied themselves with pails of liquid manure and emptied them over the sheriff officer. And they said at the time that the sheriff's officer had come to arrest the men who were protesting, who were trying to claim land. And they said at the time the women had clearly arranged beforehand to prevent the officer doing his duty and arming themselves with buckets of manure. And they were issued with fines that were paid by public subscription because public sympathy for their cause was so extensive. So we could have looked at any of those or many others. But Catherine chose one particular story to focus on from more recent history. Johanna Campbell Mcdonald. Now, Joanna Campbell Mcdonald was known as Toonie, which I love. I'm aspiring to a nickname like that. We've also got a mouse somewhere else in our collections, a girl whose name was Mouse. But Joanna, her nickname was Toonie, and that's an island name for a Skye Terrier, and her family had a keen interest in the breed of Skye Terriers. She was the daughter of Mary Mcdonald of Viewfield, Harry Mcdonald of Viewfield, and Flora McKinnon of Kylachen. And she was born in 1885. Her papers revealing information about her education in St Leonard's and St Andrews and her many social and fundraising activities are found within the Mcdonald of Viewfield collection, the family papers. The collection documents her wide range of appointments and various different roles. She was a commissioner of the Girl Guides, and she supported a wide range of organisations, notably the Red Cross. She was also a strong supporter of all things Highland and all things rooted in the local community. And again, that was why it felt like a particularly important person to talk about during this Gaelic week. Toonie was an accomplished musician, and she was described as never missing a céilí. She founded the Portree Amateur Dramatic Club, becoming the president and erecting a stage in an annex of the Drill Hall in Portree, and apparently she took great pride in the stage and spent many days and nights on it producing plays for her dramatic club. Toonie is perhaps best remembered for her role within the Red Cross and for being elected the first president of the Common Pibroch Anilan Skeanach, which is the Isle of Skye Piping Society, on the 7th of September 1936. The Common Pibroch Anilan Skeanach Their aims were to encourage the study and playing of the pibroch on the Highland bagpipes and the advancement and diffusion of knowledge of the ancient Highland pibroch. And so you can see how much that local culture and music and society and social element mattered to her. The collection includes papers about the formation of that society, and one of these acknowledges Skye's long connection with the bagpipes. It says, as is well known, the island of Skye was famous in the past for its race of pipers, and it is to be hoped that the new society will help to maintain the traditions of the island in that respect. The society did indeed find the support that it had sought, and it went on to provide a programme of teaching, bringing instructors to Skye to hold classes right across the island in Portree, in Dunvegan, in Scabost, Staffin and Strath. And this meant that many members of pipe bands at the time and more recently owe a huge amount to Tooney for her passion in encouraging and promoting the playing of the pipes and the importance of Skyach culture. And there's evidence in the collection about the importance of this impact. In 1934, Tooney wrote to William Ross, and this is an extract from that letter. She says, the class, so the piping class, the class has done very well indeed in the short time. I had to turn 8 away as the class was too large. I kept 20 on. William Ross goes on to discuss struggling to find accommodation in Skye. And he says, I regret I've had to move from different lodgings in Portree, as had all bookings in advance. So I go wherever I can find a vacancy. I make the best of it. And her work in encouraging music tuition in pipes and fiddle reached across Skye, and providing lessons was making a real impact. And she said, if I had known Kilmuir would be so keen, I would have come sooner. There seems to be a lot of boys in Newig as well, a good too many who can come to the Kilmuir class. And I mentioned that she herself also was a talented musician, and that was something that she pursued until she became progressively deaf in later life. So that's her role within the Piping Society. But Tooney's work with the Red Cross came into its own in the two world wars of the 20th century. She gave unstinting service to the war effort in both world wars. She provided comforts for the troop, fundraised and organised knitting of clothing for liberated Europe. In both world wars, Tooney served as the commandant of the Red Cross for Skye, organising the collection of sphagnum moss for medical purposes, something we see in numerous collections in our school records and various others, this collecting of sphagnum moss, which I think was used in bandages. And when I did a tweet about that a while ago, someone messaged to say he worked in the army, and he said, yeah, we still use sort of elements of that in medical purposes. She also ran the Scottish penny a week, which raised thousands of pounds for the war effort. And again, this collection includes documents about these activities, and these documents really illustrate not only Tooney's role in coordinating and organising these events, but also the huge network of women that were supporting her. So there were collectors, people going out and collecting money. There were makers, people who were making things to supply to the troops or the local area. Fundraisers, women spinning wool and knitting and distributing desperately needed money and supplies to those in need. So supplying them to the troops and those at the front, but also supplying them between themselves when things were scarce at home. And again, I just was so struck, and I know I've said this time and time again in the 2 years that I've been talking to you on a Thursday, but a reminder that archives are constantly relevant. Right now, as you will all be aware, we're seeing people collecting money, we're seeing people distributing and sharing money, supplying clothing and essentials to people who are fleeing conflict. Hopefully we have learned how to support, even if we still repeat some of history's crises. And much like today, we can see people in these records trying to contribute whatever they can while still continuing with their daily life. And particularly as many of these women will have been balancing work and home and social life and war effort work while the men were away. This is a letter from September 1944 that really illustrates this point. So this is someone writing to Toonie. Isle of Skye, 3rd of September 1944. I have been unable to collect the Red Cross money for the month of August and again this month owing to the harvest work, but I hope to be able to start again in October if the weather is if the weather is any kind of good. We hope to be finished all of the outside work and then I'll have plenty of time to collect again. I hope you understand the circumstances. Yours faithfully, Annie Campbell. So you get to see that element of somebody going, I'm doing everything right now, so I will come back and help as soon as I can, but I'm currently running everything. Janet McKinnon in the Glendale Post Office wrote regularly to Toonie about their collective war effort, with extracts such as this. 10th of March 1944. I'm enclosing £5 14 shillings which was collected for the penny a week for February. I expect to be in Portree on Tuesday and shall leave a few articles, which the very few left have finished. If you should be in the village between 12 and 1 o'clock, I may see you. I could take more sock wool for some of the older women to knit and a little sewing as well. Isn't it fine to have nicer weather? I hope you're keeping well. So you can see there that, a woman writing to Toonie saying, I'm coming in to Portree, I'll hand over the money I've collected. If you can give me wool, I'll send that back to the older women. They'll knit more socks, knit more things for the troops, and we'll carry that process on. And Toonie was clearly a woman who was very good at rallying, at motivating and coordinating others, both in moments of national crisis like World War I and World War II, but also in social causes and in things of local cultural relevance, especially with music that is so central to Skyhawk culture and the culture of the West Coast generally and the whole of Scotland. And as I say, that she seems like a good person to include in this episode that goes out during Seachtain na Gaelic. Toonie died in 1964. She's commemorated on the gates of Portree Parish Church and in the bagpipe strathspey, Miss Mcdonald of Viewfield. And if you're on Twitter, and even if you're not, I've got a way around it, but if you're on Twitter, I set a challenge to our High Life Highland music tutors. It's one of the great joys of working for High Life Highland is that we have music tutors and leisure instructors and adult learning coordinators and all sorts of other people that we can call on for help. And when I came across the fact that Toonie had a strathspey written after her, a piece of music called Miss Mcdonald of Viewfield, I set a challenge to the High Life Highland music tutors to see if anyone could track down the music and play it. And within about 24 hours, they came back to me on Twitter with one of their music tutors playing that tune for us. So if you're on Twitter, do go and have a look. But if not, I will share it in the comments of this talk when I've finished talking and you can have a wee look at it. Lovely to see. So as I say, Toonie died in 1964, but as all the women that we've talked about during the course of this month, she left a legacy and she made a difference. And I think that's all any of us can ask for, really. I hope you've enjoyed hearing about Toonie and about the other women in the Skye Lochalsh collections. If you would like more information on the Crofters' War in general, especially the Battle of the Braes, which marks its 140th anniversary this year, Skye Lochalsh Archives will be hosting an exhibition about that, or you can go back and watch previous Learn with Lorna about that. If you'd like more information on the Mcdonalds and Viewfield, then there is a list of the collection on our website, and of course you can contact Skye Lochalsh Archives for more information. And if you'd like more information on Seachtain na Gaelic, the Gaelic Week, then do visit their website or just Google Gaelic Week and you'll come across some information. As I said, the aim of that is to promote Gaelic language and culture for both native speakers and new speakers and people who don't speak it at all. So just to promote and share the love of the subject. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you can join me next week. We'll be looking at women in the Caithness collections, For those of you in Australia, New Zealand, or anywhere else, the clocks will change this weekend. So we will be a little bit, I'm not even going to say if it's earlier or later because I'll get confused, but the clocks will change. If I have advertised the Learn with Lorna's up till the end of May, so they've been advertised for April and May, so do go and have a look at the upcoming ones and register your interest if you want to join me for those. And a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. And I will share a link in the comments for the music tutors playing that piece of music. Thank you so much.